Last night I saw your face in the hollow light. You were standing tall. Welcome, folks. We'll wait a few moments to let everyone roll in, and then we'll get started in just a few minutes. I just stood there bathed in the quiet. No, you say you'll cut your bangs and call it love. When you lie to me, it's in the small stuff. You say you'll cut your bangs and call it bluff. When you lie to me, it's in the small stuff. Now you're not just foaming like a rabbit. I think we lost audio for a second, but we are still here. We'll be getting started in just a second. The float is now a clouded fog. Your teeth are gnashing louder than your monologue. And I just stood there bathed in the quiet. No, you say you'll cut your bangs and call it bluff. When you lie to me, it's in the small stuff. You say you'll cut your bangs and call it bluff. When you lie to me, it's in the small stuff. Now the flesh is melting off of your bones. The maggots round your heart make themselves at home. And where the river flowed, I am left alone. I just stood there bathed in the quiet. No, you say you'll cut your bangs and call it bluff. When you lie to me, it's in the small stuff. You say you'll cut your bangs and call it bluff. When you lie to me, it's in the small stuff. All right. Welcome, viewers. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're so pleased to have joining us three of the incredible contributors to McSweeney's 62, the queer fiction issue. So if you're sitting in your seats, give us a round of applause, please. Thank you very much. I'd like to take a moment to tell you a little bit about what we have in store for you today. And then we'll get to meet our wonderful guests and start talking about this issue of McSweeney's and what it means for the future of literature and how incredible and important it is. Very excited. First, for those of you who are new, we are Lost City Books, owned by Adam, who is a veteran and dog lover, longtime resident of DC, and enthusiastic disseminator of books. Our close-knit team is a collection of some of DC's coolest kids, such as myself, I hope, your host tonight, Shady Rose. And of course, tonight we also have joining us Nell, who is part of our team. We have artists, educators, musicians, writers, and of course, avid readers of all kinds coming together to enrich our unique environment. And again, I am your host for tonight, Shady. I'm so pleased to be here. Let's tell you about who we've got coming in tonight for our event. First is Kaiming Chang, who is let me know if I'm pronouncing this right, Kundiman Fellow at Lambda Literary Award, thank you, Lambda Literary Award finalist, and a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 honoree. She is the author of the debut novel Bestiary from Random House, One World Random House, which was longlisted for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize and named a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. Her short story collection, Resident Aliens, is forthcoming from One World. She's currently the micro-editor at the Offing magazine. I'd love to hear more about what micro-editors get up to. Lee Lai is from NARM. If I'm pronouncing that correctly, you can let me know, or if you want to chime in and let me know how to pronounce that. Now known as Melbourne, Australia, and currently makes comics and illustrations in, oh my goodness. Leo, do you want to chime in and help me pronounce that?
Yeah, it's pronounced Tiohtià:ke.
Tiohtià:ke, beautiful. Known as Montreal. She writes and paints comics and short and long form fiction and has been featured in The New Yorker, The Lifted Brow, Room Magazine, and Mean Gene Quarterly. Her first graphic novel, Stone Fruit, is due to be released by Fantagraphics in 2021. And if I'm not mistaken, it has now been released, or it's almost out. I saw a really exciting Instagram story that it's nearly there. So we'll be having that at, on the shelves at Lost City Books as well, which has been translated into 4 languages. Amazing. Emma Copley Eisenberg. Emma Copley Eisenberg's fiction and nonfiction has appeared in McSweeney's, The New York Times, Granta, The Virginia Quarterly Review, Tin House, Guernica, The New Republic, The Washington Post Magazine, Esquire, and others. She is the author of The Third Rainbow Girl, The Long Life of a Double Murder in Appalachia, a New York Times notable book of 2020, and a novel and story collection forthcoming from Hogarth/Penguin House, Random House. She lives in Philadelphia, where she directs Blue Stoop, a hub for the literary arts. All right, and time to bring in our, I'll start my video as well. Let's welcome our guests. If you all would like to say hello to our viewers, you are live. Whoa. Yay. And for those of you who may have met Nell before, Nell is here too from Lost City Books to discuss these amazing contributions. And you might know that Nell runs our monthly queer book club. So we'll have a lot to talk about today. So if we can, I'd like to open up by giving each person the opportunity to talk a little bit about their specific contribution. I know we have 2 stories and 1 comic that were contributed to from the 3 of you, from one each from one of each of the 3 of you. And I'd love to hear more about sort of your perspective on contributing to McSweeney's 62 and what it meant for you to contribute your specific story. I had the opportunity to read a few, but I want to hear your perspective first. I'm gonna call on you if you don't raise your hand. Hei-Ming, would you want to start?
Sure, yeah, I can start. Yeah, so I was so excited to see that first open call that Patrick Cottrell put out about kind of an expansive definition of queer fiction, because I think I'd always been a bit self-conscious thinking like, oh, is this right? But it was such a kind of welcoming and kind of broadening of the possibilities of what queer fiction could look like. So I felt very excited to get the chance to submit. And the story that ended up being selected is called The Chorus of Dead Cousins. And I have this like joke with myself, so not really a joke, that like I only write 2 kinds of stories, and it's like encounter with a weird girl or like, oh, look, a ghost. And those are the only 2 genres that I dabble in. And this story was like the beautiful marriage of both of those elements. So it features a very strange love interest and a lot of ghosts. And I had noticed in my writing before I'd written this story that there was this kind of chorus of cousins that kept creeping into my stories. This kind of collective voice of the dead that I was really interested in, the kind of porousness between the world of the dead and the world of the living. And so I was like, you know what? They deserve a story. They want to speak. They want to act up. And so this was kind of my dedication to, The Chorus of Dead Cousins. And I originally went in just thinking, oh, I want to have this kind of collective ghost body. But what was really interesting is that kind of in the foreground was this relationship that it's not a relationship I would want to be in, very not ideal, that's kind of about like tensions of like class and race within this queer relationship. And I think one of the stories that really inspires me, that continues to inspire me, is Dorothy Allison's River of Names. which is a story a lot about what you are unable to say to someone that you are very intimate with, about what you carry and what your history is. That is just like so incommunicable to someone with a vastly different life from you. And so that's kind of one of the central tensions for the narrator, is that she has all of these cousins, and she has this familial history that she carries that is just and like bodily history that she carries that is just incommunicable. And what would happen if that kind of manifested in a very obtrusive and invasive way, and hence these kind of riotous ghosts that come along with the relationship. So yeah, that's the story.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to think about the interaction of the concept of a ghost and all with the manifestation of trauma in a way, or the manifestation of kind of what you were saying, I guess the embodiment of the challenges that this character is facing. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about that and sort of how manifestations of sort of social and emotional challenges relate to this body of cousins, this ghost body of this conglomeration, the chorus of dead cousins.
Oh, should I speak? Oh, is this for me? Okay, I just wanted to make sure. Yeah, no, I think what's really interesting is that, you know, the narrator in some ways is she's kind of been, she has a distance from death that is representative of her various privileges. And so I think she has this desire to distance herself from this kind of chorus of dead cousins, and she's been able to, which is its own thing. I think one's distance from death says a lot about your position in the world and in your life. And so I was really interested in kind of converging her with death and with those cousins and with her familial history. Yeah, and seeing what happens when that distance is no longer possible, and what it means for her to have disowned these kind of familial ghosts for so long. And so it's kind of a reckoning for her, for the narrator herself, as much as it is about this kind of dissonance between two people in a relationship. Yeah. And I wanted the ghosts to also be very playful and not only to be kind of embodiments of trauma, but also to be kind of not very definable, not kind of like what we're used to seeing a traditional kind of Eurocentric ghost of like the exorcism or like paranormal activity, where there's this idea that you could exorcise the dead, which I feel like is a very Western idea, that you can purge yourself and be clean of like death and violence and trauma. But this is like a different kind of ghost, a different kind of haunting. And it's about kind of inviting it and embodying it rather than like purge, be clean. There's no more violence. There's no more history. Slate wiped clean. Yeah.
I wish I'd read your story because I love ghosts as a literary a literary device. They're awesome. And so it seems like in your story, like the ghosts, obviously you said that the ghost sort of emerged as a character through like your process, and like I wonder if you could like kind of speak more, like you said, it's like a familial ghost. So sort of how those like familial ties are playing into the like narrator's relationship. Cause I think that's like something that isn't sort of addressed in queer fiction, where it's like very often sort of like the like you're disowned by your family sort of narrative, where it, you know, a lot of, now it's, you know, way more complicated and way more nuanced. And so I was wondering if you had any like sort of thoughts about that when you were writing, or just in general.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about the story River of Names by Dorothy Allison is that it's talking about family, not in the context of like a kind of like coming out narrative of like, oh, acceptance or rejection, that kind of binary, but rather talking about family and family trauma and intergenerational trauma, and also just like family history. And as a way for the narrator to say very honestly what created her, what she is formed of, in this kind of very elemental way, and also what she is kind of both running toward and away from. Like there's this kind of balance. And I was also really interested in that, not necessarily seeing the family in the kind of like one-sided way of like how do they, like what is this one kind of interaction, but like this kind of grander, more ancestral understanding of like accumulated intergenerational trauma and how it has formed this character, and also like manifested in this relationship as this silence. And then of course the ghosts themselves being very, very vocal, and very, very rambunctious and very, very disruptive. Yeah, and I think it's so funny because like I remember when I was like first writing stories, we were like, is like a queer story? Is it a family story? And I was like, oh, what a bizarre kind of binary to place on this. And there are so many forms of family, ghost families and chosen families, and also like what I'm just interested in, I guess, like subverting that narrative that there has to necessarily be like a shedding or an exorcism or a purging of you know, the past or this familial history. Yeah.
It's great that you bring up that interesting binary between family and queerness, right? And I'm sure many of us have felt that binary kind of pop up in our lives. I'm interested if you would like to speak more on how you felt when you reached your realization that that you were kind of interacting with that binary, and that, I guess, that dualism, like the queerness versus the family, as if they must be oppositional, you know, which I think a lot of us have experienced or been taught or seen people experience, right?
I guess in my writing, I've never really seen it as a versus. I think I'm really interested in like the queering of family, and I think a lot of what I write is also just like fan fiction, like family fan fiction, in which I kind of imagine a character as not alone, or as having queer ancestors, and thinking a lot about like erased queer ancestors and erased queer histories and ways to revive those, and bring them back to life, which I guess this is a resurrection story. So I guess that makes sense that I'm very interested in kind of revival, and also of like kind of matriarchal and like women's stories within the family too. And I feel that is kind of all connected, because I think, you know, the patrilineage is very not queer. And kind of, I think, redefining storytelling outside of that can be like a way of, yeah, queering storytelling. Yeah.
I think that's really beautifully put. In the ghosts, sorry, let me make sure I'm getting the title right. The Chorus of Dead Cousins. Can you tell me a little bit more about the central relationship? And then I have a question from one of our audience members for you. But can you tell me a bit more about the central relationship and how that sort of formed in your mind, and what experiences informed it as you were writing it?
Yeah, this came out of another joke of kind of like my mom and I laughing at white people who seem to seek their own deaths. We're like, you know, doing these extreme things and like dangling from cliffs and chasing storms like on purpose. And my mom was like stunned by this because she's like, I grew up in a typhoon ridden place, and the idea of getting near a storm seems so counterintuitive and just utterly bizarre. And so I wanted this character to kind of be the antithesis of the narrator in a lot of ways. And hence she's like, she's a storm chaser. She like seeks death as a career. When the narrator is like, I have spent my entire life, you know, distancing myself from death and being told that the purpose of your life is to kind of distance yourself from death, because your ancestral history is tied to it. And so I just had a lot of fun with the narrator kind of poking fun at this of like, oh my God, like that is you're a stormtrooper, like that's the whitest thing I've ever heard. Like just kind of poking fun at it a little bit, but then also having this very dynamic interaction between them and dramatizing the kind of distance between them. And so a lot of it is about what the narrator is unable to say or to communicate, and this kind of unbridgeable between them. But I think it's a very necessary distance. And that also, it's really interesting because the narrator, I mean, the love interest and the wife in the story, the way she sees the cousins are kind of like, oh, they're kind of pests and nuisances. And again, this idea that you can somehow exorcise the ghostly. So they're very they're very opposed in a lot of ways, but also weirdly symbiotic because they're not very self-reflective people.
That makes a lot of sense. And actually, the question from one of our viewers for you is related to what you got into a little bit there. From Patrick, he says, at the end of the story, the married couple escape their ancestors by using a tornado. Is this unique to the married couple? Are you saying that every new couple needs to escape their ancestors in order to be free, or was this couple situation unique?
Yes, that is the new thing you have to do on your honeymoon is you have to find a tornado and just jump into it. That's like the new ritual of like bonding with one another. No, I think it was really interesting because the tornado ends up kind of being made of these cousins. It's like this wild energy that is kind of consuming everything around it. And I think the narrator realizes that there is no escape, and that the cousins are a part of her, and that's why she's unable to escape them. She's like, gee, I wonder why they're always with me when I'm here. And I'm like, because you are made of them. And I think it's a kind of irony that the wife is kind of leads to this big realization in this big moment. But I was like, there's like a metaphorical storm, so why not make it literal and be really kind of a little bit sci-fi with it.
Yeah. Thank you. I love it. I love it so much. I'll take a moment to open the floor if the rest of our contributors have questions.
I actually had a very quick question, or maybe it's not a quick question, I don't know. Can you hear me okay, by the way? I haven't zoomed much. Okay, great. I haven't read your story, but I cannot wait to, because I also love ghosts as literary device, and like finding lineages of queer experience and queer existence in the past has been like a really exciting thing that I've talked about in my own community for a long time. Especially, I mean, specifically related to the Asian experience, because I think it's often like pushed into a corner quite intensely. But the question I had was about what you said about your characters not being very self-reflective. And I like personally have really enjoyed writing not self-reflective and not self-aware characters as something that ends up giving the reader a very particular experience of how they discover the character, while the character's in kind of a hot mess of a lack of self-awareness. And I wonder if that's intentional for you, and like what your relationship to your characters is as you write them being not self-aware.
Yeah, I find that ends up often being like the propelling thing in the story is that like lack of self-awareness, or the fact that the character embodies two very opposed things but isn't able to reconcile them, whether it's like desire and disgust or a desire to distance oneself and also to kind of be consumed by it. And so yes, I also enjoy that a lot, and I feel like a lot of my stories come out of like this very unself-aware sentence or piece of dialogue, and I'm like, who would say that? And I'm like, I know who, and then I kind of build the world around who I think would say something, and how that kind of unravels and makes repercussions happen.
I think that's an interesting method, because it's kind of like a genesis almost. Like you take the spark of the character and you build the world around the character, rather than maybe trying to necessarily copy someone from life, or replicate people that you know. I think that's it's dear to my heart as a writing style. I think this is a good opportunity, Lee, though, if you would like to take over and talk a bit about questionable content and your contribution to.
Sure. Speaking of not so Hawaiian characters. Okay, I guess I can summarize it pretty quickly. It's a pretty quick read because it's a comic. I'm a cartoonist and I've been making comics for maybe the last 6 years or more. It is just a kind of a vignette, as often my short comics are, of these two girls walking down the street. It's during the pandemic because it was a quick sketch that I wrote at the beginning of the pandemic in the first few months. And very simply, it's just about one of them sharing some gossip about her dating life in the pandemic, where she is hitting up a bunch of other queers online for nudes. And the other person is kind of trying to say anything, contribute anything to the conversation, and just keeps getting cut off. And it wasn't written specifically for McSweeney's. It was something I wrote just to kind of acquaint myself with a set of characters that had been sitting in the back of my head for quite a long time. And generally my process for preparing for a book, I mean, I'm talking like I've written many and I have not, I've written one, and I'm writing my second one now. But what worked for me the first time was spending some time to just get to know the characters and feel out who they were and who they were in relationship to me before I wrote the longer form story. And so these characters are two characters I wanted to write for a very long time for very self-interested reasons. I think there's been just like some of my own experiences I've been chewing on that I wanted to figure out in the form of fiction. And so these two characters, the names are Trish and Lucy, but mostly she's just called Canon. And they have been friends for roughly a decade. They're very much millennials. They speak very much like millennials. They're both gay. They're both Chinese. And they've gotten to that point in their friendship where they once really needed each other for the ways in which their identities and their lived experiences are similar, but they're actually extraordinarily different people. And as they enter the kind of long-term friendship era of their relationship, they're trying to kind of figure out whether they like each other and whether they like the people that they've grown into. And the kind of question that I wanted these two characters initially to address, and who knows, by the time the book is finished, I'm not sure if it's still going to be the question, but the question that I wanted to kind of explore and chew on with these two was the funny experience of having gone through so much with somebody and being somewhat trauma bonded from kind of connecting at a time where you desperately need somebody who's similar to you, and trying to reckon with the fact that you might deeply love them and you feel quite codependent with them, but you're not sure if you like them anymore. And all the other things that surround that. And so anyway, this sketch was written just as a way of testing out how able I was to communicate their personalities through very simple and quite shallow dialogue. And Sunra Thompson, who is part of McSweeney's, emailed me and asked me to pitch some things, and this was the one that I pitched, and we kind of had some really great chats about it together. And I'm honestly really glad that I didn't write something specifically for McSweeney's, because I really admire the journal, and if I had, I have a tendency to shit the bed when I'm trying to make something good. So yeah, I think ideally I just want it to be something that makes people laugh and is an enjoyable read and a fluid read, because I think I'm somewhat dyslexic, and honestly, like, just being able to write things that get people from point A to point B and give them an emotional experience of any kind is like quite a feat for me as a producer of any kind of content, and as a reader as well, because despite it being difficult, I love consuming stories more than anything.
It was very well put. Oh, no, go ahead, Mel.
Yeah. Oh, there we go. Yeah, I got a chance to read there's still an issue with my sound? There we go. Sorry. All right. Yeah, I got a chance to read your piece, and I'm a really big comics fan. We did Fun Home for my book club, obviously a classic. But you were explaining, like, in the plot of the story, how like I forget which character is which, but the one character who's talking about her dating life, and then her friend, I loved like can't get a word in edgewise, and I loved how you did the boxes to like to illustrate, pun semi-intended, to illustrate that, because it just like it got the points across so well, and it really like you achieved your goal of making the comic flow that way, and like making it really real to me. And I at the end I was like, I do want to read a whole book about these people. Like, their small conversation there was like so packed with just like, you could tell that they have a deep history, and how interesting that is, and how it's like sort of manifesting in this sort of casual but not casual conversation. And so maybe we could like talk about the actual conversation they're having, because it is relevant since it's the pandemic and queer dating, and maybe sort of like your experiences on that, and sort of what you were thinking when you came up with that idea for them to have that conversation, so work out their personalities.
Yeah, like specifically this conversation, I think I picked partly because it was the beginning of the pandemic and it was all anybody could talk about. And it was also spring and we were entering into summer, and I was surrounded by queers who were still experiencing the emotional trappings of spring transferring into summer. I mean, I'm in Montreal too, and it's like the winters here are grueling and long and nasty. And so coming into summer is a very big emotional ordeal. Like, people are breaking up left, right, and center. It's like a real time. And also, at least as a millennial, like, my experience of queer spaces have been that people just aggressively date, and like also like aggressively bond, like whether that's just intense roommateships and just like hyper intimacy in all forms. And so it's been interesting seeing what's happened to the queer community in an urban setting also during a pandemic, and a pandemic in which the main form of survival is staying the fuck at home and not touching anybody. And so like watching the ways in which queers around me are kind of edging around that in order to get their needs met. And it's like, maybe it's just sex, but I think it's a lot to do with intensity and intimacy. And seeing how that translates into cyberspaces has been really fascinating. And watching the ways in which people who are historically not that candid just being so extremely candid with people they do not know on the internet. And specifically Trish, who is the tall, lanky, short-haired character who's gone on about these really off-tap nudes she's receiving. She, in the story that I'm writing now, is what I would joke is like a bit of a hungry void character. She's kind of like lacking in self-awareness and also lacking in groundedness in herself. And so using physical intimacy and sexual intimacy in ways that are probably quite reckless and irresponsible. And also definitely trying to fulfill an internal vacuum that's telling her that she doesn't actually like herself very much. And that's like, I don't think that necessarily is packed into this tiny little vignette, but I think one thing I was trying to figure out in this particular sequence was just the kind of bluff and bravado that she uses to get through all of her conversations physically and handle what could be maybe a vulnerable conversation with a level of kind of casual candor that won't let anything more volatile come to the surface.
Yeah, like it read to me yeah, it read to me like Trish and her friend, her name flew out of my head. So like she's like trying to like sort of reach out and share, but instead of like authentically sharing, she's sort of like, look at this weird thing. And you can tell like with what you just said about like their relationship, like now I'm sort of like, oh, this context sort of makes sense, where it's like that's why she's sick of kind of hearing this, because it's been a decade and she like knows that it's like trying to point out like what the issues, like isn't that person that you got that nude from isn't that someone else's hand in there? And like just hand waving it away and just like not even really listening and engaging, more just like sort of performing, I guess, is sort of how it came across.
Yeah, I think like one of the challenges of comics, and for me one of the joys, is that you don't have a lot to work with. Like I've never been a fan of putting narration in my comics. I work almost exclusively with dialogue. And so kind of the motivation in which I will write a sequence is often like how much can I communicate through what might be very silly and trivial and surface level dialogue, and also how much can I allow a reader to project their own experiences onto the thing. I had a pretty interesting conversation recently with another writer who really resents people kind of like taking their work and running away with it based on their own experiences. But to me, it's somewhat the highest form of praise to be able to have people looking at the work and finding it relatable, or recognizing characteristics of people that they know in their own life. And at least for Trish, I would hope that someone can recognize the more vulnerable and not endearing, but like be able to look in a compassionate way at someone who's just really terrifically annoying, you know, and to know what kind of insecurities and loneliness and hungriness is going on underneath the kind of noisy, hectic surface, you know?
Absolutely. I have a quick question for you, and then to have something from our one of our viewers, but it's very related to what you just said, which is having that compassion for someone who's what did you say, terribly annoying, but also the relationship that your comic describes, or at least begins to delve into a little bit, that long-lived relationship where the two people are sort of figuring out maybe for the first time whether or not they actually like each other, right? And I think that speaks to, I mean, granted, I'm sure that many, many types of people have had that experience, right? But I think it speaks to the bondedness and longevity of queer relationships, friendships, and romantic relationships, and how found family tends to work. Like when you mentioned trauma bonding. So I'd like to hear your thoughts a little bit more on sort of like what that relationship style, how it sort of manifested for you, and what that means to you, what your experience is, if you want to talk about that.
I mean, I think this is definitely not a unique experience, but I think I went through, like I came out, at least to myself, when I was a teenager, in my mid-teens, and there was this kind of joyous revelation of, oh, this is why I don't like everyone I'm surrounded by, because I'm gay and no one else is gay. And then as I kind of exited high school and started trying to carve my own path, it was very much a self-determined thing to just be friends only with homos. And at first it was a very intentional thing. And just kind of joyously thinking that, oh, like I like everybody, I'm gonna like everybody who's queer. And then later on it was like, oh, I'm just gonna like everyone who's trans. And then slowly, as I went through various awful, awful, dank queer share houses and queer nonsense also, because people are messy, especially in their late teens and early 20s, you know? It kind of then ups to, oh, you know, it's because white queers are awful and I just need to surround myself with queer people of color. And even though, like, I'm still only friends with queers, I think my methods and means of aligning myself with who I actually get along with is not so identity-based, or it's certainly not explicitly identity-based. Like, if I meet another Gaysian who's also trans, who also happens to be a creative maker, then fabulous. But that's definitely not going to be the reason we get along. And I think in my learning of that, I watched other people around me who are of similar ages going through the same learning and realizing that even though we might feel a certain level of alliance or generosity with each other because we share certain identity traits, that can't actually be the foundation in which we build really big intimacy. And I think specifically because, at least from my experiences and what I've seen around me, there is often a level of scarcity mindset coming into how queers find each other and connect. I think people are willing to overlook some glaring red flags as to whether that person's going to be emotionally safe or going to see you and respect you for who you are and not use you, or any of the things that kind of puts relationships into strife. Because at the very base level, the needs are getting met because they're finding someone who's walked through life in a similar way. And so this story, in its larger form, outside of this vignette, is kind of watching these two people come into hopefully a different sense of power that makes them ideally become more grounded themselves, but also start to question the need in which they placed onto this relationship, and maybe the need for the relationship, where as it melts away is starting to reveal some of the reasons why it's actually quite unhealthy.
Dang, everyone who's listening now, please go ahead and read that. You can find it in your very own copy of McSweeney's 62. I do have a question from Adriana for Lee. I'm really curious about your process for drafting a comic. How do you edit or go through multiple versions in making text that's also visual art? Oh, you're on mute.
Could you repeat the last bit, Shady, just the end of the question?
How do you edit or go through multiple versions in making a text that's also visual art?
Cool. It's a good question. Well, I mean, it's difficult. It's difficult to edit with comics in the same way. And this is my first experience, like in the last 12 months of putting a long form thing into the world and working with a publishing house and working with an editor. And I was shocked to learn that the editors in the comics industry don't really edit that much. They kind of just check the typos and then put it out into the world, which like just blows my mind, because like things are terrible until you edit them mostly. Like a lot of the things I write on the first go are just total trash. And so like I personally feel like pretty lucky to have a lot of people around me whose opinions I trust and who also are not shy to tell me what they think. And so I tend to write things just as a script, probably similar to a screenplay, since it's so dialogue heavy. And I'll generally send it to someone at that stage, which initially was a really horrifying thing because I don't trust my writing as much when it hasn't got pictures to distract you from any flaws that might exist in the writing. And then from there, I'll break it into something that I can illustrate. And I'm surrounded by cartoonists who put a lot more thought than I do into the actual construction of the page. Like, because a comic page is a diagram, and there's so much, semiotically speaking, that could be achieved in the ways that you marry text and picture together. And there's some really amazing examples of artists who are doing that today. as comics gets more into the mainstream, I guess, or alternative comics becomes more mainstream. But I tend to be pretty sparse and straightforward about the ways that I line my comics. It's almost always just a full grid for me. I use the same brush and ink that I've used for years now. And most of my concern in the ways that I draw my comics is wanting their bodies to look not realistic, but to be able to evoke what bodies are like. Like I want people to be able to look at the drawings and be able to know how those arms are swinging, or how that fabric is folding against that armpit, or I don't know, just know that that person's clammy. You can just tell by the 3 lines that that person's a bit clammy. And those kinds of, I don't know why that's so satisfying to me, but it's always been satisfying to me to draw people and to draw them in some way that makes them recognizable, even if they are highly stylized. And to try and create faces that can convey a lot of emotion despite them being, I don't know, quite stylized and having little peanut eyes, you know? So the drawing part has always been relatively straightforward, as long as it tells you what's going on and as long as the characters can seem highly emotional despite the lack of detail. I think it's probably getting done what it needs to get done. I don't know, everyone.
Sorry, I might have cut you off a little bit there, my bad. Yeah, thank you so much. I think, Emma, if you would like to tell us a bit about your story. And I'll also remind our viewers that you can drop your questions in the comment section of this video. A few folks have chimed in with their questions already, but we will have a few minutes towards the end of this event as a Q&A available. So remember that you can comment your questions below.
Cool. Yes. Hello. Those are so lovely. I really enjoyed both listening to you both, Lee and Kaming. Yeah, my story is, I feel a little less, I don't know, it's weird. It's sexy, I hope. It's based on a basically like an urban legend that I heard when I went to prep school in New York. And basically there's so many things that I think we look back on now that were just sort of like, oh, felt a little weird, and now are like, oh, that's really fucked up. Yeah. So I felt like basically this was a based on a true story that like circulated in my prep school and many other New York schools like in the early 2000s, which it was about this girl who had sex with a Swiffer on video and sent it to a boy, and then the boy fucked it up and sent it to everyone, and then she became this pariah, and everyone kind of thought that she went to their school. Like I thought that she went to my school, and then all of my friends thought that she went to their schools, and it was kind of this just like, I'm not even sure if she was real now, but it was kind of like this story that just got repeated over and over again in this very particular like micro moment of like, I think I was like 14-ish, like 2001, like actually really close to September 11th too. And yeah, so I think I just, the first line, you know, the story is, do you remember Swiffer girl? And that was just all I started with, because I was like, I think I remember, like I think I heard that, but I don't even know if it's true. And that's basically all I had to go on in terms of like true material, and the rest is totally imagined. And it's just kind of imagining like, if this person were real and really had made this video in the early 2000s, what did that mean? And like, what does it mean for the character who's kind of like a nerdy, non-sex having queer child to be viewing that? And I think it's really interesting because at the time, I remember it definitely being like, she was crazy, like that crazy girl who made the sex video, you know? And now we have lots of terms for what this boy did, you know? And like, it's such a huge violation to release something so intimate that's not for you. And it's also a really like, if this is real and this girl is real, now I'm like, bold, interesting moves. But at the time, everyone was like, isn't that gross and isn't that scary and isn't she such a slut and all the things, you know. So I think it was just kind of trying to apply there's a few different like zones of time, I hope, in the story, and it's kind of told from the perspective of an older queer, like in their 30s, who's like a lesbian who's married to a lesbian, and just kind of being like, remember when I was not sure what that meant, and kind of just like reevaluating the viewing of that video in an older, sort of hopefully wiser lens. Yeah, so right, who knows, there's many layers of truth and untruth to the original experience of the thing, and then there's lots, hopefully, layers of truth and untruth in the story itself. So it was really fun, and I'm like really pleased and quite surprised that lovely Patrick took it for McSweeney's, and because it was a weird story that kind of made its rounds, and people were kind of like, my agent was like, what's a Swiffer? And I was like, come on, like people had a lot of questions. So I feel like it really needed the queer context to thrive. So thank you so much.
We'll circle back around to what is a Swiffer, because I'm a little concerned by someone who has never heard of a Swiffer. But I did notice that your story opened with a few kind of key elements. One was the element of place and identifying, like, where is the Swiffer girl from? Is it from the Bronx, or like from Brooklyn, or my dad will never go back to, was a line that stood out. There was that, and then there was also the sort of casual abundance of like hostile male gaze and like sexual, like ambient sexual violence that this youth was sort of passing through. One of the lines that stuck out towards the beginning of the story is like, I take the train, 3 trains to school every morning, and I'm guaranteed to see at least 1 penis per train, you know? And that reality of sort of like hostile male gaze meets ambient sexual violence is such like a pervasive reality. I'm curious to know sort of from your perspective, what role did those elements kind of play in developing this story and this character?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I feel like, so I did grow up as like a kid in the Westish village, I guess, like west of where it was kind of like fancy, but then the fanciness really grew up around my family in a really intense way as I got older. And yeah, I feel like New York in the 2000s was like this very particular moment that will never come again. And it's not like boohoo, like poor me, because like lots of privilege coming from that place, but I think it's just like a reality that that place, like that block where the story is set, this girl grows up, like it doesn't exist anymore. It's like a giant CVS basically. And so I think I was trying to yeah, just really channel the energy of New York for a kind of plump queer girl who would move within it at that particular time, which is sort of before New York got super fancy and gentrified, but after that was starting to happen, and you know, sort of after like the big sort of cleanups of Times Square and kind of gentrification of the mine stuff that Sarah Schulman talks about. And yeah, so it was weird. I did like the sort of like hostile male gaze stuff like is real, and I do feel like I read Jessica Valenti's book Sex Object a few years ago, and she's like a little older than me maybe, but not too much, and she talked about growing up in Queens in like that time, like late 90s, and that yeah, just the amount of street harassment that she received being like a very dominant experience of growing up as a kid in New York at that time. And I just was kind of like, oh God, like I like forgot. I think I really like blocked it all out. And so I think in writing this story, it was kind of interesting to open that back up again and just kind of see like, yeah, that was that I think especially like it's an interesting experience to be like a queer woman receiving street harassment, and it's an interesting experience to be like a queer fat woman, and then like transposing that onto a little girl too. So I think it was the narrative of the story is like trying to figure out how all these like pieces of like sex and violence and power, I think hopefully like all fit together, and they're kind of related, like the fact that this girl made this like private sex tape that was leaked to everyone, if she even existed, up against like New York at that time being a place of like intense scrutiny and totally penises all the time. I think they're related. I don't know exactly how, but it felt like they were needed to be in the same story. And just like the micro stuff of New York at that time, like I grew up in Manhattan, but my dad's from Brooklyn / the Bronx. And like, yeah, every borough had like different stories of this Swiffer girl. You know, it was like the story from Brooklyn was different from the story from the Bronx, which was different from where I went to school. So, and like, you know, there's the schools that sort of like have their own campuses and are like I was a sort of solidly middle class kid going into a really, really, really privileged high school. And like the class stuff I hope bleeds through a little bit too, which is relevant to like that transitionary time in New York. Yeah.
Yeah, I got a chance to read your story, and it definitely was, it kind of threw me for a loop, but in like a good way. Like it is weird, and like when I finished it, I like had, it was the first one I read, so I looked and I was like, okay, this is fiction. Like because I wondered like how autobiographical it was, and I have a tangent about that we could get to later on like a bigger sort of idea of autobiography and queerness. But to sort of go back to like your actual story and the idea of like sex and like sexual violence, I thought it was interesting that it's like this queer character is surrounded by like heterosexuality, like the narrator's sister is like, that's like a big sort of symbol, or for lack of a better word, but you know, and like talking about her boyfriend, and also like Swiffer girl herself, whether she's real or not, was doing this for a boy, you know, and like what is like how I feel like I remember like sort of trying to reconcile like my queer attraction around that age with the male gaze, and like how like what does that mean, and like does that make me gross because I like kind of am into that, and like sort of like I think I'd definitely like to hear more of your opinion on that, and also like how it like being an adult looking back on that is also like very a theme in your story too. So
Totally. Yeah. I feel like there's no easy like way to process all of that information, especially when we are like young people. And I mean, I am from New York. I did go to prep school, like I said. And there the sort of truth ends. But I think yeah, I was really interested in trying to think about like, right, like it is an aggressively even like I guess I'm always fascinated by like I did grow up in New York. I grew up in Chelsea specifically, which like gays palooza, and yet I think that it wasn't necessarily like communicated at the cellular level that like queerness was a thing that I could be. It was kind of like, especially like for men, it was like gay men are over there like having a great time, but like I don't know if I am over there, you know. And I think that I do, not everything has to be about New York. And for the record, I live in Philadelphia and most of my fiction is now about Philadelphia. This is literally my only New York story, so I apologize. But I do think that there is something about like New York as a queer city that also doesn't get communicated to people who are sort of outside of that, like kids, young people, working class people. It's not like there or accessible in the same way. So just because I think something happens in New York doesn't mean it's like this utopia of freedom. The gaze and the violence was there. That I know and feel is true from my own life too.
Thank you. And I have a question from our audience. We have Patrick, who says, Emma, I read this as one of the first cautionary tales / urban myths of the internet era, the moral being watch what you post on the internet because you don't know how far it'll travel. It sounds more as if you were concerned with the woman herself and wanted to explore her motivations and humanize her. Is your story both or one or the other?
I think it's both. Yes, I did not mention that indeed it was like we had YouTube, but that was it, right? Like we didn't have like like supposedly, again, in the myth, I did never watch this video. I don't even know if it existed, but in the story, she does watch the video is real and she does watch it, the character, and it's on YouTube. And I think, or maybe it's like, remember we had those chain letters that would come through email where it was like, if you don't send this to 7 people, like you're gonna die, or like your mom's gonna die or something. And I feel like that was like, it is true that I think this, I tried to say this in the story, like, I think that this particular sort of myth could only have happened at this particular time in this particular place, which did have to do with the exact moment that we were at with technology. I think that I'm like not maybe self-aware enough to have extracted the cautionary tale element, although I do love a good fable. I think, yeah, I think I was interested in not just Swiffer Girl herself, but like the people around her, people who repeated the story, the people who viewed it, the people who shared it. Because I do think that like these things they don't come from just like one asshole. Like they come from like a lot of people sharing this stuff, right? And that's how people get shamed, and it's a lot of people participating. And so I think I was trying to think about like, yeah, why would someone watch this? Why would someone share it? And who was that person at the center of it? And who are the people, like the narrator in my story is like thinking about it like however many 15 years later. And so I think I was trying to think about like, why did this idea of this thing, if it was real, stick with me? And why would it have stuck with a lot of others who had been touched by it? And I do think it's like, yeah, this was before we had the language of like slut shaming, or before we had the sense that the release and the transmission of it was bad. It was just kind of this like free, open act of just like, well, it's out there, so I might as well share it. It is true that we didn't have a sense of like those consequences then, which I do think I was interested in also. Yeah.
Very well put. And it sounds like it's interesting because each of your contributions, the 3 of you, have in some way something to do with drawing boundaries, whether it's Emma, your story, which is the violation of someone's boundaries and how that idea can affect someone for years, even if you're not the one whose boundary was violated, right? But, or Lee, the boundary between these 2 friends where one person is like, you don't let me get a word in edgewise, you're always talking about these things, all this baggage is being brought up. How do we redefine the boundaries between us as friends, or caming the boundaries between the real and unreal, and family and queerness, as we talked about earlier. So I'd like to move into sort of an open discussion between the 3 of you about some of these common themes that your contributions have, and also to talk about queer literature in general and some of the themes that you see that coming up in queer literature and queer art, and how you see that as unique, or what it means to you, what you've observed.
Oh my God, so many thoughts. I will just say a couple and then be quiet. But I just really love this idea, Lee, of like codependent trauma bonding, and then do I like you? I feel like the idea of like uncategorizable relationships is something that I spend like many hours up at night, like thinking about, being like, how do I put this down in a way that will make sense to other people? And I think there is something that was really lovely about this experience, to just be writing in community, I guess, like that this is largely for a queer audience, ? And the beautiful way that Patrick and others at McSweeney's designed it. Like when you open the issue, it just says this is a trove of queer fiction. I was just like, like it was just so beautiful. So I really love that idea. And I was curious, Kaming, like, are ghosts queer? I feel like they're a little queer.
Sorry, I had to find my unmute button. Yes, I feel like ghosts are super queer. Ghosts are gay. Yeah, I think so. The thing about like the lack of definability that is part of the beauty. I think the kind of inability to define what queer fiction is kind of is what I love about it. And as somebody who writes in a very speculative space, a lot of elements of fantasy, or the what is real or unreal, like what you said, I think the permission in that freedom to blur those things I think were kind of enabled by thinking about queer fiction as this perpetual blurring and messiness.
Yeah. I just want to posit that I think all monsters are queer. And like, I think that Ming, to kind of jump off what you were saying and how you write in a speculative way and sort of a trend in queer fiction, at least sort of as I've been trying to curate stuff from the book club, I feel like I've been doing a lot of sort of classics quote unquote, like Ruby Fruit Jungle and like The Price of Salt. And I just did Zammy, a new spelling of my name, and they have this sort of really interesting thread, and I'm like, man, does every lesbian just write like a autobiography type deal, like a fictional, semi-fictionalized? And I mean, I think we're going to continue to have that, because like the thing that comes to mind is Carmen Maria Machado's In the Dream House, which is beautiful, but God, it's in a heart-wrenching read. But I also feel like we're seeing a lot more queer fantasy, which I'm like super stoked about, because like there's just like, I don't know, like such a dearth in mainstream fantasy. And like, I feel like queerness has been relegated to like it was relegated to like the pulp novels and like just like real lived experiences. And it's like, why don't we like have fun, and explore queerness through like more interesting ways. So I read Gideon the Ninth, which I thought was really great earlier this year, if you guys have read that. And there are a bunch of other ones that aren't coming into my brain right now that I want to read. So yeah. Anyone have any thoughts off of that? That would be good.
I'd love to say something about this because it's something that I've been talking about a lot lately. And like, I love the idea that there's going to be more queer fantasy and queer speculative fiction. That just makes me so happy, because my experience of consuming queer stories, at least in the kind of queer films and books that I was finding when I was younger, was a lot of autobio stuff, or just like hard realism, often like, I don't know, stories like Boys Don't Cry, which is important. It's so important, but it's also so fucking rough. And like, I'm very excited about the idea of more queer fiction that looks like it's like pushing the limits more in terms of how we just see the world around us. And I don't think it's any less helpful in terms of figuring out hard things and figuring out the harder edges of what it is to be queer and what a queer experience is. Like, have you all, I'm assuming you might have, because it's kind of in the canon, but have you read Stonebush Blues by Leslie Feinberg?
Not yet. It's on my list.
Oh God! I mean, brace yourself. It's a fucking heartbreaker. But there's this bit that Leslie writes at the beginning. It's in one of the editions. It's in the intro. It's a really, really wonderful intro. I read it years ago, but it has stayed with me ever since. And it's come to really inform the way I think about fiction writing and queer fiction writing specifically. Like, that book reads like an autobio, but it is explicitly fiction, and they frame it as fiction, and that's very important to the way that the book is understood. And they write about that in the intro as they wouldn't have been able to write as emotionally vivid as they had written it unless it was fiction. And if it was something that they had written directly from their life, they wouldn't have been able to push into the level of intensity and emotionality that they were able to explore. And even though I don't think my stories deal with quite the level of hardship that Leslie Feinberg's work did, I think there is something about fiction enabling explorations of ideas and emotional themes and lived experiences that, for me, in my cagey ways, is impossible to explore in the form of autobio. Like, I need a veil of fiction and invention and imaginative conjuring, I guess, to be able to chew on ideas that are very real and very personal, but I could not do it if I was writing about my experiences. And the idea of taking that a step further, like, I write mostly realism with like sprinklings of magical realism thrown in, but being able to push that further into something like sci-fi or fantasy just like is so exciting to me. Yeah, I wonder if other people here had to say things about the way in which fiction and the fact that it is not specifically real or from your real experiences, like how that works for you in terms of what you want to explore.
Yeah, about also like lesbian autobiography, I was like, call me out. I'm kidding. But what's really funny is that even though, I mean, my first book is like that too, but I do write with a lot of elements of fantasy and magical realism, and specifically like bodily transformation is something that often happens, you know, like growing a tail or growing talons or growing teeth in strange places. Like there's a lot of this kind of like bodily transformation or like alchemy. And yeah, that really resonates. I think there's something about I don't know, like very kind of like tell it slant, Emily Dickinson-esque idea of like kind of slanting the truth, and like the need to kind of approach something at a slant, that feels very, I don't know, important to me. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Emma.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I mean, very, very well said, and I don't know that I have a ton to add except for when I return to Stone Butch Blues for 1 second and say that it is so. I think what's so special about it too is that it has such a grand spirit, has such a warmth of spirit. It's not. I mean, I'm very much here for like all the tragedy and all the like rough stuff, but it's not a recitation of tragedy. It's not a list of horrible things that happened to Leslie Feinberg or the sort of analog Leslie character. And it's also so hot, so fun and sexy, that book. And I feel like it has one of the most like beautiful depictions of like a large, tall, sort of fat femme that like was like my like whole, she was just like such an idol for me as a character, and like with her big glasses. I don't know, I just feel like it was such a sweet, there's so many sweet queer couples in that book, like really functional, long, with a lot of longevity queer couples that just like gave me a lot of joy. And yes, I am like, I don't know, my current project is like, I like hopefully maybe to say that it's like The Price of Salt but funny is my hope. And I'm hoping that like it is a road trip novel, and I just feel like I'm like, Patricia, why do we have to be so sad all the time? I mean, to her credit, she that was like the first like happy ending of like a queer book, right? Which I still don't really understand. I'm like, happy-ish, but yes, those are my thoughts. Is just like all must read Stone Butch Blues and Price of Salt, though could be less sad.
That's funny. I actually thought The Price of Salt was hilarious because Therese is just a gay mess all over the place. At least the first half is funny, and then it gets sad, and then it's like kind of okay. Yeah. But I am working on my own writing, and I am working on a semi sort of, I'm like, well, I'm just gonna keep going with that trend to like a semi memoir thing, and it's a lot of things, but I am also finding that trying to think of it more as fiction and not like an actual retelling of my life, and like trying to think about what details I want to change. And one of the things I'm doing is jumping around with what is it, like the narrator perspective. Yeah, the perspective. So like some chapters are in first person and some are in she her, when I was still identifying that way. And then it's a work in progress. I'm still playing around with it, but like it is definitely easier to sort of tackle those harder emotions when you're trying to take a step back and more narrativize it and make it fictional versus like, oh shit, that really happened to me, didn't it?
And I want to take a second here to first to invite our viewers to leave your questions in the chat as we're coming up on our last couple of minutes here. But also, I want to kind of wrap everything that's been discussed so far up a little bit in a discussion about, so we've talked about how queer literature has kind of been shifting away from the auto-bio sphere, and we're finally emerging into the limelight of speculative fiction and other kinds of fiction. And I wonder if you all have any thoughts on whether or not that has much to do with the rejection of the kill your queers trope, which I'm sure we've all come up against, especially in early queer fiction. It's like, the only way that the characters get to be queer for any part of the story is if they die in the end, or if some deep tragedy befalls them to essentially, in a literary sense, punish them for their queerness, right? And now that more and more readers, especially queer readers, are rejecting that and looking to tell different kinds of queer stories. Anyway, I'd like to hear what you all think about that, and whether or not you think they're connected, or how they might be or might not be.
I know I can say a short thing about this. Like I don't love the trope. I don't know if any queer writers that I can think of do, but like one thing that has been interesting to me is having the publicity side of my first book coming out, and people being like, "Oh, this book is about gender." I'm like, no, like it's got a trans person in it, but nothing about it is about that person's experience as a trans person. They're just trans and in the story. And like, I don't know how often I go about trying to write a queer story that is specifically queer. I think at this point in my life, it would be highly unrealistic for me to write straight characters because I don't know many straight people. And I don't actually know much about the straight experience also. And so maybe they can be accessories to my stories, but I think I would hope that I just write about things that are familiar to me in one way or another. And that happens to be homos all of the time. And so like I was even wondering what I would say coming into this, because I haven't thought about my stories as specifically queer beyond the fact that everything about it is queer by accident. And I think like it is nice to be able to write stories that are queer by accident. And it's also wonderful to encounter stories that I'm not expecting to be queer, because they're about so many other things that ideally are also quite universal, but they also have queer characters. And for queer readers, there is so many things that are recognizable in that. But yeah, just the idea of writing about stories that aren't specifically designed to be like capital Q queer story. And then people can kind of take it from there, and readers can take it from there.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And I definitely like feel the idea of like, this is not right. Like, just because it has a queer character in it doesn't mean it's a queer story. I think, however, conversely, I get really annoyed at straight people who like toss in a queer, or like not yes. It was a wonderful book and I love so much about it, which is why I'm extra angry. Like Kevin Wilson's Nothing to See Here. There's a queer like sort of moment or twist, and then it's never discussed again, and there's no sense of like consequences or lived inhabiting of like that queer moment. And that just made me so mad, because I was like, I feel like indeed like there should be queerness everywhere, but there should also be this awareness of what it means within the story and its gravity as well. And so I feel like it's like a double bind maybe for straight people, but I don't know. I think that yeah, I think that I am really interested in humor, for better or worse. I'm really inspired by like Jewish humorists like Grace Peely and Laurie Siegel, and I feel like being funny is also in the sort of, it's in the Jewish vernacular and it's in the queer vernacular too. We've always been, you know, making jokes for our supper, and I just feel like that's a direction I'm interested in. And humor, I think, and jokes stretch into the fantastic sometimes. They're not necessarily like as cool as, you know, ghosts or monsters, but I think that the joke like the sort of setup and timing of jokes introduces a sort of strange like gap or rhythm that is sometimes like not always found in like the serious queer fiction that we've had in the past. So I'm excited about reading more funny fiction and reading more fiction that's about like queers who are friends, not necessarily like fucking each other, and queers who have conflict that's not about queerness. Like, yeah, I mean, everyone loves Tori Peters' new book and it's amazing, Detransition Baby. And I think what's so lovely about that book too is it's like the character's really snarky, and it's like, it's sort of like if Jane Austen were a trans woman, which I love. And it doesn't have to be, it's about life of these three trans women who are all really different, and that was lovely. More of that, please.
Yeah, I love that. I also wanted to bring up, this makes me think of this article that Brandon Taylor wrote called "Who Cares What Straight People Think?" And in the article, I think what's really beautiful about it is, I think we might also have a tendency to think of like kind of a linear thing. It's like tragedy and sorrow on one end and like humor and joy on the other. And that queer fiction somehow has to travel from one and like progressively through time as society changes, move into another. And what I really loved about that article, it's about containing both. It's not about like, oh, like no more suffering, no more grief. Because I think, at least for me, there's always, even in things that are very funny, like I just turned in edits for a short story collection and I thought it was like horribly tragic and grief ridden. And my editor was like, this is the funniest thing you've ever written. And also it is very grief ridden. And so I think there's something about that like containing of both, of being both like ecstatic and joyous and also full of grief and rage, and to have all of those things, and to not necessarily feel like you have to be one or the other all the time. It's just like we know we're all of those things. We know we're, so we don't have to. Yeah, who cares what straight people think? That's the title. And that's the subtitle. Yeah.
Yeah, agreed. I think also, like Shady, you had mentioned the like barrier queers and moving away from that. I think also like I just watched a interesting YouTube video about like transphobia in media and how like it, at first like trans people were like the butts of jokes, and then slowly we're like, oh, they're like trans people are sympathetic characters, and like aren't their lives sad, and like shouldn't we like be sympathetic towards them? And I think also like with like gayness as opposed to like transness, even though queerness is all mixed up, but it gets like broken down in these small boxes, like, or straight people try to break them down into boxes to make it understood. And so like with gayness, I think recently it's been, or at least when I feel like I was growing up, it was a lot of the coming out narrative. And like that was what a lot of things were like focused on. It's like, oh, if it's a gay thing, it's about coming out and like dealing with your queerness. And I feel like now that queerness is more mainstream, we're getting sci-fi, we're getting fantasy, we're getting funny stuff because we aren't relegated into a box where it's like, oh, it's queer, it's sad. Like you were saying, it's like we're moving away from the boxes we've been put into.
Absolutely.
That was like a really formative. Oh, sorry, Shade.
No, go ahead.
Did anybody else see Alice Wu's Saving Face back in the early 2000s? That rocked my world because it was the first gay movie and gay story that I consumed that was funny in a really long time. And it wasn't like, it was a bit about coming out, but it was also just about them being gay. Like they're both gay at the start of the story and at the end of the story. No one's having a crisis about their sexuality. And it's the first time that I got to see a story. Yeah, and femme, totally. And like, it's the first time I got to see a story like that, that was about their parents as well and about their community, and was just really silly, while also being very real about the experience of being queer and the experience of being an immigrant in America too. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I'm just so excited by all of the new queer work that is coming out. All of the new queer work that's coming out. I'm really excited to read Detransition Baby, for example. It just looks so exciting and relatable. And we are getting up on our time right now. So conveniently, Adriana from our audience has a question. This conversation has been so lovely, heart-faced. Can all the writers please share their upcoming projects and where to find their upcoming work?
Yay, okay. Yes, I am writing a novel that will come out sometime in 2022, we think. I don't know. Will there be books then? We hope so. And then a story collection in 2024, I think. And I'm Frumpenberg, like the frumpiness, but Frumpenberg on Instagram and Twitter.
Yeah, it's just funny that I mentioned fan fiction because I wrote a really micro chapbook that's coming out in June of this year. That's Wuthering Heights fan fiction. I was like, I'm gonna rewrite Wuthering Heights, but it's gonna be queer and they're gonna be Taiwanese American. Because there's a lot of interesting orientalizing of Heathcliff in the original, and I'm like, yeah, let's lean into that. And then next year in 2022, I have a short story collection that's coming out, and The Course of Dead Cousins is in it. So, been excitedly revisiting it. So, yeah, thank you, McSweeney's.
Yeah, I have a book coming out in May. It's my first graphic novel. It's 230 pages. It's about a breakup and queers being queer aunties to a very rambunctious 6-year-old, and queers being siblings with their somewhat estranged sisters. And it's coming out with Fantagraphics in May 11th, or if you're anywhere other than the English-speaking world, it is coming out in various different European countries. And the next book I'm working on is called Canon, and that's not going to be out for a very long time because making comics is really slow. But I tend to post little sequences from it to kind of take the temperature of how they're working on Instagram, which is mostly where I answer my messages, and you can find me there at _Leli.
Go ahead, Nell.
Cool. Just wanted to plug my book club right at the end here. Probably will be featuring stuff from these lovely folks sometime this year. See, and also, but for this month, Shady, did Adam ever get back to us about Lot, or should we just say we're doing Skim?
We'll talk about it later.
Either way, look out for my book club. We're either going to be doing Lot by Brian Washington, or Skim, which is a comic by Maria Tomiko. I think that's right. Yeah. So, and also you can always join even if you're not in DC, because we're doing them on Zoom and we'll ship the book to you. So just wanted to plug that for myself.
Awesome.
It's so beautiful. It's like it changed my life. That book is so good.
Oh, I love it. I've read it before, and I'm like, let's do a book I've actually read before again.
All right, and for I saw someone ask the question, how can we be a part of your book club? If you're looking to be a part of the book club, you can go to our website, lostcitybookstore.com, and you'll find there's a button there for book clubs, and you'll see all the upcoming clubs, and you can join them that way. Or if you email us at oracle@lostcitybookstore.com, we will hook you up with the book club. I'd like to take a second to thank all 4 of you, of course, for coming out tonight and joining us and having this incredible conversation. I have had such a great time talking to you all. I'm excited to read more of your work and to see how what the future brings for you, and for all of us aspiring queer writers who might, want to now get published soon. Thank you so much, and thank you to our viewers for coming in and giving your whole attention to our beautiful folks tonight. If you want to find McSweeney's 62, it is on the shelves now at Lost City Books. We've got a bunch of copies, and you can read them. And let us know what you think. For now, I'll bid you all good night, and we'll see you soon.
Well, that went well. Oh, you're done. Oh. Can you still hear me?
Hold on one second.
No problem.